All right, we're a little after 1, so gonna get started as everybody can take their seat. I'm Cody Frenzel. I'm a solutions architect at EPON Technologies. We're a software consulting company. That's why we're here talking today about software craft and organizational performance. It's something I get a lot of questions about for clients. So it is generally a topic I talk about a lot, and I'm very passionate about it, both from measuring developer productivity and also being a very strong evangelist of software craft being good principles for how we build code. All right, so how many of you are developers and would consider yourself a craftsperson? And what I mean by that is focusing on building quality in from the beginning in our code. All right, a good number of us, that's great. So I get a lot of questions, and when we talk about it, I like to try to explain to clients, and the need for this is that we can have two of these things. So building quality in and making the project cheap. We will not be fast, but really overall, I think the end outcome actually is faster from our overall goal. Like, we may not be delivering individual features faster to start, but over time, you'll see that as an organization, if we invest in this and in continuous delivery, that we actually will be fast. So how do we actually measure that software delivery performance? Our performance is actually going to drive how fast we can actually deliver, drives how profitable and how our organization actually performs. And to deliver that quickly and with stability is basically the premise of what we're going to talk about and how we actually measure. So if any of you know for your organizations or at a thought of generally how people measure software performance, what metrics do you think they use?
Agile metrics. Scrum metrics.
Scrum metrics, yeah. You can say velocity. I'm gonna yell at you that that's not a metric for delivery performance. That's a capacity planning tool. Depending on how old you are, I have never measured by lines of code as a developer, but measuring by lines of code has been a metric that has since been replaced, but or utilization, like utilization of your time in actually coding. And all of those focus on actually output, which is a problem that can help reward busy work. We want to focus on outcomes. And with that example of velocity, kind of brings me to talking about Goodhart's law, which says when a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a good measure. So a lot of these metrics can be gamed. Lines of code, I can just write a bunch of code, and they become really easy to game, and then they're not used, they cease to be a good measure. I worked for a client that forced every developer to have 8 story points every sprint. They said every developer can do 8 story points. That doesn't make sense because, again, pointing itself is already subjective to everybody. But then you're fixing a team's velocity across the board, and then that's easy to game. So as the tech lead, I didn't like that because eventually then, based on what we said our capacity was, sometimes we didn't have enough work, so then I'd change all of the points and drag in as much work as I thought the team could do. And then so you may end up with a situation that looks like this, where we triple the number of story points, but we don't actually do anything. Or you do what I did, and you change your estimation method, and then your velocity changes. So how do we actually want to focus on that? And what we're going to talk about is the 4 DORA metrics. If you're not familiar with DORA, they're DevOps Research Association. So they're funded by Google. They have been producing the State of DevOps report for the past 10 years. And they've done all this research across thousands of organizations for many years, and they found these core 4 metrics for everybody to focus on. If they told you too many more, you'd probably lose track of following them, so you really focus on the 4 that measure how fast we can actually deliver, and then how stably we can deliver. So our measures of tempo are our change lead time, so from our first commit to code deployment. This is really going to help us focus on fast course correction, get that feedback loop by how fast we can actually get code into production for our features. And then if we have an issue, how fast can we ship that issue to production? So that's also our change lead time, so how fast that goes. Our other one is how frequently we're deploying. So the more frequently deploy, the more efficient we know our deployment and CI/CD pipeline is. And if we have issues in either of those, we can look at cycle time or lead time. So lead time is going from when our stories are created in our backlog to production, and cycle times from when we start development to production. So if our change lead time if we're not seeing the change we want in change lead time, that could be pointing to either planning or to maybe something in this development process as an issue that we're not seeing this number get faster. So those metrics would be good indicators, but we're really looking at change lead time as the primary metric there. And our deployment frequency, the same. If we're not seeing deployment frequency go up, is there an issue in the way we're planning work, or is there an issue in the way in our code review process or our CI/CD pipeline? Yes.
So on that one, do you also have the UAT, the business user acceptance, built into that timeline as well somewhere?
Yes. So in there, between our code review and deployment, is everything that you would need for your change management process. So depending on how automated it is, that itself would also add time in the change lead time. All right, so that is how fast we go. But we don't want to sacrifice our stability to be able to deploy with speed, because if we're just trying to deploy fast and then all of our deployments fail, we didn't really get anything. So how are we going to measure with stability? It's our mean time to restore, or MTTR. And that's the time it takes to recover from a failed deployment. So the lower that number is, it's really great for us. And then we have a resilient and responsive system. And then our change fail percentage, which is pretty obvious based on the name, and that is what percentage of our deployments actually fail. And we care about these because when we fail, we actually end up going back through our change lead time. So you can see our 4 metrics kind of play on top of each other. And we don't necessarily care with our change lead time or deployment frequency, deploying 100 times a day, because you're probably not releasing 100 features unless you have a lot of developers and you're a really large organization. But if you have a really high change fail percentage and that you're failing a lot, you want to be able to get a new deployment out quickly so you can see how those play on each other. I want to revisit Goodhart's law because our metrics aren't a goal, but those 4 are really good indicators of how an organization is performing. Those can also be gamed, like I was just mentioning, that if I have the keys to be able to deploy and say we need to deploy once every day, and then I can hit that number for my organization's leaders and say I'm deploying every day. But if I'm not actually deploying anything meaningful and I'm just putting out a new deployment so that metric goes up, we didn't actually get anything out of that. All right, this one we're going to jump in a little into what good looks like from Dora's perspective across all of their research. That elite performers you can deploy on demand. Your lead time for change is less than an hour. Your time to restore is less than 1 hour, and your change fail rate is 0 to 15%. If you can think about where your organization lands on all of these, what Dora says from their research is that the elite performer, like if you're really good at software delivery performance, you're good at all 4 of them. You don't make sacrifices on one to be really low in one section and high in the other. But you may be across there. Even a medium performer deploying once per month and once every 6 months is pretty low, but then the jump to high between once per week and once per month is not necessarily bad at being a high performer compared to an elite performer.
I have a question.
Yes.
Is this more for just small incremental changes and not like new feature development?
So it's actually both, because these metrics are for our product delivery for what stories and features we're releasing, but then also like any hot fixes or issues that we ship through, like any bugs that come through, those also factor in. So then just like statistically taking averages of those is how we end up lowering those. And then also as a note of that, like this data is from organizations of all sizes. I think it was like 20-something%. It's like enterprise-sized companies, but then you also have companies across the board of small startup to mid-sized company. Yes.
So regarding change failure rate, I feel like that compared to these others depends a lot more on like external feedback. And I'm wondering, so both like I'm wondering if that rate kind of extends past the kind of delivery point of a product, if you know you track that, and then also if there's a way that you collect that information through like some sort of testing or QA or follow-up interviews with users, because I feel like users aren't always very dependable in even reporting things that aren't working or that are working less well.
Yeah. So this is definitely. You're not just pulling these metrics from your CI tools. I mean, Jenkins or whatever deployment your tool telling me could tell how many failures I have in my actual deployment in like verifying that my infrastructure is stood up. But also as part of change failure rate, what we're factoring in there is our percent. So like, because a lot of these are built on lean principles. So in lean, that change failure rate is also the percent of your like feature that you're releasing that's correct. So did we release the correct thing, or do we now have to fix it because it was either wrong or not accurate to what we were actually trying to build? So some of those may come from Jira, like looking across, like is our epic actually closed and done, or do we create new stories for that? All right, so now that we know how to measure those metrics, how do we actually increase our software delivery performance? The overall goal of this research was saying that our software delivery was built on these 5 pillars. So our culture, continuous delivery, architecture, product and process, and then lean management and monitoring. And what they mean by culture here, I like to say our craft is culture, because it is across the board the organization's willingness to kind of buy in to, one, investing in these things, convincing somebody in some organizations is occasionally harder to say we should really focus on our platform and fixing this because we have a lot of issues versus delivering another feature and balancing those. But also highly collaborative organizations are the successful ones. In their research, they call that a generative culture. And then so also comes to when we have issues, it's not like the messenger is not killed. Everybody can very openly talk about what went wrong. How do we prevent it from happening next time, instead of sort of like a blame culture. And then in general, I like to ask people what kind of developer forums you have within your organization for kind of keeping your platform aligned, not necessarily your team refinements, but like for engineers as a whole and discussing issues. What kind of forums do you have? Do you have like architecture review board, or maybe like code level changes where you need to align on patterns of, is our platform only going to use a certain tool? Any of those?
Use COPs, communities of practice.
Okay, yeah. So are those in your organization, are those optional meetings?
Yeah, they are
Okay.
voluntary, so.
Do you ever have like any action items that like we are going to, like a decision made and implement, like how do you propagate those decisions out to everybody since it was optional?
Yeah, so these are more innovative but if those are talking about the decisions made, then we have other channels of
Mhm.
communication. We have like open office hours every month with the
Mhm.
leadership, and that's where we bring the assemblies or the teams that are implementing to present what it's going to be. If a decision is already made.
Yeah.
The COPs are more like collaborative to determine what future things we need.
Mhm.
So we have both,
Okay.
both forms of forums.
Yeah. And so those are great. I think those are really important to an engineering culture for those reasons of being able to collaborate as a group and then push in another forum, get those decisions out. They kind of start, when you don't really have those, or you don't have a clear process on how you weigh, like depending on what your organization's like engineering structure looks like, for like either having like an architect or somebody actually steering overall platform health, it is hard to get like tech debt or like fixes prioritized that say like we should really align here. We're doing a lot of different practices across services, and if we align, it'll be a lot easier for everybody. So yeah, like I like to have a lot of lean coffees around that. So like a lot of organizations, like we have like a tech scrum, so we have lean coffee. Some of those things, like topics can be socialized in community practice, and then we come to a lean coffee to actually discuss the overall solution, if that aligns, and then get an action item, get it prioritized, and then get somebody working on that. And then what I like for new organizations, if their software delivery performance is really low, kind of all over the place on continuous delivery practices and patterns, I really like a principle approach. It is a methodology where you take a really high degree of rigor into your expected process and you really adhere to it. So really outlining, these are all of the practices we follow. This is how our code should be structured. This is how our unit test should be structured. We only use these design patterns. If you want to introduce a new design pattern, you have to present it at some kind of forum, make a defense for it, and you can't just introduce patterns kind of all willy-nilly, because then that's how we end up with a very unmaintainable code base, and then we have to fix it later. All right, moving on to our continuous delivery. These set of capabilities help enable us to get our changes out into production safely, quickly, and sustainably, so across the board. Those are helping with that. The more capabilities we have, Dora's Reach is basically saying, the greater performance and delivery speeds we see. And so there are a number of capabilities actually predict our overall performance in how we're performing as a software organization. And then they had these 5 key principles of continuous delivery, and that we want to build quality in. When we work in small batches, automate everything, basically, is what that means. And we want our developers to actually work on solving problems. We want to relentlessly pursue continuous improvement, and then making everybody responsible for our platform's overall health. It's not one team, it's not one person. If we're buying into that from the beginning and everybody's taking a shared responsibility to do that, it should lessen the burden and lessen the amount of rework that we're having to do for all of that. So how do we start to enable continuous delivery? In which we want to focus on comprehensive configuration management, continuous integration, and continuous testing. So we want to be able to build, test, and deploy in a fully automated fashion. Changes to any environment should happen the same way every single time, should be versioned, should be automated. Our continuous integration, we should have very short-lived branches, because then our code base or our changes that we're releasing should be very small and contained. Should be really easy to review, and that was going to really reduce our actual change lead time. If we have really big, long branches, then I don't believe that there's a way you can tell me that you're actually deploying very quickly. And if you need long-living branches, you should probably assess how we're actually breaking apart work and how you're slicing it to be able to release, or invest in something else like feature flagging, so that you can release bits and pieces without actually having it being live in production, so that we can build in a small piece, test it, and then push it to prod. And then continuous testing. I already had a talk on testing today, so if you were there, you know I really like testing. But we don't want to do this just when a feature is complete. It's super essential into making sure we're building the right thing. And then if your company has manual testers, we still want to invest in automated testing as well, because our automated testing is trying to catch those really easy things. Like our unit testing is driving how we're actually building our code. And then if we do have testers, we can send it to them for verifying, doing exploratory testing, doing usability testing. They should still be at the very top of our testing pyramid, in that they're running less tests than we are actually automating. If they're running more tests than I have automated tests for, then something's wrong. And it's a really good indicator that something's wrong. All right. So maybe my last slide talking about theory for continuous delivery, but Dora has this idea of a J-curve. As you pursue continuous delivery and improving your ways of working, you may encounter this. So as you identify quick wins here, we may see a bump up in our improvement, like we started automating, but then our automation added a bunch of new requirements. So actually now we're releasing slower. This is kind of like the main case of continuous improvement, in that we certainly did get an improvement. We are faster here. Now we have a new bottleneck, so we need to assess our bottleneck, improve that one, and then we'll keep performing, and then we'll end up actually coming out higher than we were over here. I know it's really hard to try to sell somebody on the fact that when you invest in something, you may never be done, but you can certainly, over time, incrementally improve and still see those benefits without truly ever being done with an investment. So I also want to kind of talk about like the process side of that as well, of not just, I talked a lot about like tools that we can implement, but also our process, like depending on our change management process. Ultimately, that still may be a different bottleneck if we look at our entire software delivery lifecycle. So improving those processes as well, in either how we're refining work, somewhere in the middle of how we're approving and verifying work, and then ultimately releasing it. Like everything encompassed in there is part of our software delivery lifecycle and factors into how fast we can actually release. So assessing processes as well is really important, and you can do that by doing a value stream mapping. So like I was mentioning, if we view everything from planning to actually deploying as our actual value stream, right now we can kind of see how where our 4 metrics play into here. And so if we are failing our deployments a lot, our failure rate is going to increase, and then our recovery time may also increase depending on how fast our lead time is, factors into our recovery time. So actually our value stream from planning to deploying is actually 2 value streams, in that you have like your main feature one, and then you have the recovery value stream. So how fast do you recover from like urgent issues? Because those are the same thing. Any deployment factors into that. So if we look at maybe improving in one area, like now all of a sudden we can deploy really fast, but we're failing a lot because maybe we're not releasing the right thing, or we're releasing bugs. Maybe we have flaky tests. But why are tests flaky? If we investigate that, what if it's actually our definition of ready and how we're actually defining work? Because there's ambiguity that's causing flaky tests, or we're just wrong. So that's why if we look at our entire kind of like if you do domain-driven design and have ever done an event storming, value stream mapping is very similar, that you can basically do an event storming across your entire software delivery lifecycle, map out your process, who those actors are, you can find pain points, and then you can work on fixing those. And then by working on fixing those, you can do outcome mapping and saying, I want to reduce the percentage of deployments that cause failures in production. So then how do we actually get there? You can align benefits to that, obstacles of doing that, and then any next steps. And then those next steps can actually help you outline iterative steps into how you get there overall. And I think it's a really good tool for that. I think this is number 4 of our 5 pillars. So we're almost there, but architecture, it's one of the biggest barriers to increasing tempo and stability, because if we have a really tightly coupled system and you have a lot of services, it's the foundation of our work. Changing that while we're still moving can sometimes be difficult, and it can be a hard selling point to tell somebody that they architected something wrong. Even if you built microservices, does anybody work in a microservice environment that uses domain-driven design? Would you say that your domains were correct on the first try? I don't think anybody's ever answered yes to that, because it's really hard and they do change, and you do have to recarve those domains, and you have to be very intentional about it, because then you can just start, if you try to stick to the old ones, you may be introducing things that aren't necessarily real events, but they're just triggers to another thing so that you can try to keep your current architecture. And then you may end up tightly coupling it because you're like, hey, we added this new service because it's not part of this domain, but it has to trigger this, and then you may end up with a little cycle going on there. But it's hard. And it takes a lot of planning beforehand, but I still even think when I ask people that, I don't know if anybody has even said they think they work in a true microservice environment, because at some point maybe tight coupling will exist, but maybe an acceptable amount depending on how fast you can release. Is it tolerable for your organization? Then the other thing they mention is architecting for empowered teams. It's also why I like those engineering forums, communities of practice, is letting the developers discuss, they deal with it every day. They see the problems, they see what's working for them, letting them talk about it, letting them prioritize things that are really big pains, because they see those bottlenecks. Because you may tell me that, we need to focus on our software craft, our developers, everybody just writes code really slowly, code reviews take a really long time, so we're not deploying very often, but it may end up being all kinds of things, and it may be based around our architecture, and then a strategy of reliance on maybe testing the whole platform, and now we have to run a bunch of end-to-end tests because we're not releasing in an isolated fashion, or it may be our planning and our definition of ready, so then we have a bunch of rework. I think somebody mentioned this morning, acceptance criteria changing. If that's happening in the middle of the sprint, obviously that's going to delay your story. And it also really doesn't respect the idea of having sprints and developing in sprints anyway, but that kind of falls into your change fail rate because it was the percent accurate, that you were not accurate to your story because you added new acceptance criteria, so you're wrong, so it takes longer. And then our product and process, last pillar to be talking about, but we want to gather and implement customer feedback, ideally as quickly as possible, because if we're not building the right thing, we want to be able to change that. And then we want to make the flow of work very visible. So we know where we're spending our time, and that also includes like hidden work, that if you have people working on investigating bugs because they're on call and your service is in production, if you're not tracking that work, you're not accurately tracking the amount of hours that somebody's actually spending, so then you kind of may be inflating metrics, or if you're just fixing bugs silently and shipping them, you are not really factoring in that change lead time for your critical path, so you don't actually know how fast you recover from bugs like that. Working in small batches, I like to mention that a lot. Again, fast feedback loop, super important. And then fostering and enabling team experimentation. I like this example a lot of working in small batches, because without this then, if I am only releasing instead of, this is 8 times, yeah. If I release once instead of these 8 times in small batches, I have 64 times as much risk. I have 8 times as much cycle time. I have 0 learnings before any point of potential failure. And then so this kind of conflates that the longer we actually wait in our releases to production, that we're dramatically increasing the amount of risk that we have. And then you have a large amount of work in process that needs to go. And if we can just release iteratively, maybe we figure out here that we're actually just building the wrong thing and our customer doesn't want it. We just saved ourselves a bunch of time. Lean management monitoring was actually the last one, which is also super important because observability is hugely important, because especially in microservice environments, if you don't have good observability into your system, you probably don't have a ton of insight into the health of anything. And having really good observability can also maybe point out if you have any issues with your architecture. Like if you're eventing over REST, which I'd also say you shouldn't really do. But if you're doing that, or maybe you're just calling multiple microservices, a really good use case of observability and like pointing out the importance of it is that you may not have known that some developers over a bunch of distributed teams built in a call to, you start at one service, call a couple of other services, and this service actually calls your first service, and if all of that's over REST, the port is still open, and so until everything resolves and comes back, all of that is still waiting on your system to actually respond. And so you may actually see that you have a little cycle like that, which also, again, means that you should probably re-architect your architecture or change the way that you're working. Yes, so monitoring our applications and infrastructure, that should inform our business decisions, like re-architecting a part of our system. We should always know how healthy our system is and know as fast as possible if something's wrong. You'd rather have your system tell you that than your customer. I have been in an organization where that's happening and a customer informed them before they knew something was wrong, and frankly, it kind of seems really embarrassing if you're like, I had to have somebody that just uses the system tell me it's not working, instead of all of the fancy tools you can have deploying in environments like AWS, like your alarms, if you're monitoring things correctly, you should be able to form to that very quickly. Visualizing work to monitor the quality and then communicate that through a team so everybody can see it. You can report to leaders on how that is. And then, again, small batch sizes, limiting WIP for lean management, and that lightweight change approval process that I mentioned. The lighter that is, you cut out some process in your release. All right, only a couple more. Wrapping up, it's kind of why I would advocate that we need to treat our entire development platform as our product. It's imperative to invest in these practices, like I said, working those small batches, understanding the ownership that every individual engineer working on the platform has to keeping it healthy and building that quality in is overall how the organization is going to improve. And then this is kind of a good summary of everything that Dora says for all of their research. Our continuous delivery, really high level, is that our capabilities, so everything on the left, the more of these, say what they define as good things that they're investing in, predict our overall software delivery performance, because then we should see, these 4 metrics go up. We know our SLOs, those should end up increasing. And then they predict our outcomes, which are going to be our organizational performance and then overall job satisfaction, reducing burnout and rework, because nobody wants to do any rework. So that's kind of everything that Dora says. A lot of that research you can also read. I think after the first 4 years, they made the book Accelerate. They produce the State of DevOps report every year, but that is a really good summary. But the book basically verifies, I would say, a lot of things as an engineer that I always felt, that I believe in these practices, I believe in software craft. We should do domain-driven design, we should build a loosely coupled architecture, like all of these good practices. And then it was nice to read that and find out that there's an entire team of researchers at Google that researched these things, and then they're like, in fact, those are good practices. So if you ever want to make a change in your organization, you can look at things like the State of DevOps report and get some ammo for your argument about why you should make those changes, which everybody likes. All right, does anybody have any questions? That is it for my talk. There's a couple of ways you can connect with me. If you weren't here in the beginning, that's my dog, King Louie. He's also been at EPON with me for 7 years, so he's senior developer now.
So on your first slide, with the lead time and cycle time, can you go into that one?
What? That one.
So what's the unit that goes into your backlog? And is it like a one-to-one from there to your actual change?
What's the unit that goes into my backlog?
Like someone also mentioned, is it a feature, is it a user story, is it a defect, right? Because that can impact,
Yep.
the size of it can impact your cycle times and
Yeah.
sometimes. And again, one item into the backlog may need multiple changes to go in, or otherwise, it could be the other way. Multiple backlog items can be coupled into one change.
Yeah. So this would be like a story going into your backlog, and we should be writing our stories that I can write it and release it into production. And if we can't do that, we want to think about how we're slicing it or what capabilities we're enabling to be able to do that, like feature toggling. Like if it is an incomplete feature and I don't want to release that REST endpoint, I can toggle it off in production, and then so I can test it in different environments and keep it toggled on in QA or UAT, keep it off in production. I'll go you first, then you next.
So the Gothard law still applies even to this, right?
Yes.
So I can game this by just slicing everything into as tiny pieces as possible. You know, like so,
Correct.
Like, without impacting the outcome, my measures look better, right?
Mhm.
Like, because like now my deployment frequency is through the roof, my lead,
Yep.
change time is smaller and all that kind of stuff. So again, like, I mean, I don't know, how do you, deal with that, right?
Yeah. It's basically not to make a metric a goal. Metrics are good indicators of performance. Like I said, they can be gamed. I can just keep deploying to prod. If you're my organization leader and you're approving deployments and you let me do it, I can say we deployed 100 times today. If we didn't deploy anything important, does that metric really matter? No, it doesn't. But overall, like if we're trying to just monitor our own health as a platform, these 4 metrics that are measuring overall outcome, if like we're trying to be true to the actual metrics, because then if our change lead time is decreasing, we're releasing something valuable at a faster rate. That's what that means. But if we're arbitrarily reducing our change lead time, then yeah, then it doesn't mean anything. Mm-hmm.
So, one of your slides mentioned like encouraging experimentation and innovation.
Mm-hmm.
That seems like almost like a hard topic for like various workplaces because it, on its face, looks like it decreases speed, right?
Mm-hmm.
I'm curious if if within this kind of framework of thought, if there's a way that you are able to like measure the impact of that specifically, or like how does that impact these metrics that you're just talking about?
Definitely. And for the experimentation, what I generally like is try to have like some sort of like innovation day where people are like working on problems to solve something around the organization. A way you can measure that is you can see like, all right, what was actually discussed on this day? Like you revisit it later and you're like, how many of these actually made it into like a production thing that we did? Like, did developers actually solve a problem like they as engineers faced, or like the operations partners were facing, like maybe they helped observability and we got a like measurable outcome out of this one day and we improved the platform. But I think like doing it something like that in like a structured manner like that is usually an easy way of tracking it, having it kind of like ad hoc, I guess, unless you're making like an epic and then tying stories for innovation to that one epic and then seeing if any of those get accepted. Could be another one, but generally that, or like the communities of practice where engineers can talk through some of those problems and then propose a solution is that way. Or even similarly, through a community of practice discussing like, hey, maybe we have 2 opposing theories on even the way we're doing something, and we build it in one service, build it in the other, and say later, we're gonna come back and see which one of these is actually like we preferred over time, and then we'll align everybody to that one pattern. But it's also a good way to try to split some of that investment and like try it out in one service, try something out in another service, and then measure results and see if you get a line on a tool, basically. All right, any other questions? All right, well, thank you, everybody, for showing up.